February 19th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. 6,000 Americans were dead or captured in 6 days. A young soldier named Eddie Larkin, a welder from Pittsburgh who had never fired a rifle before 1942, pressed his back against a burning half-track and watched the world end. Around him, men he had eaten breakfast with that morning were running. Not retreating, running, screaming, throwing down rifles. The desert air smelled like burning rubber and something worse. The 10th Panzer Division's tanks rolled through American positions like a fist through wet paper. Officers were shouting contradictory orders over radios that nobody was listening to. An entire battalion, 900 men, surrendered without destroying a single German vehicle. Eddie Larkin had crossed the Atlantic to fight the greatest military machine in human history. And in 6 days, that machine had made the United States Army look like a school drama club performing war. 6,000 casualties. Entire units dissolved. Equipment abandoned. The most powerful nation on Earth humiliated in the desert sand. But here is what nobody talks about. 21 days later, those same broken men, the same shattered army, would stop the Germans cold, force them to retreat, and hand Field Marshal Erwin Rommel the assessment that would haunt German high command for the rest of the war. 21 days, not 6 months, not a year. 21 days to transform the most embarrassing defeat in American military history into the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. And it happened because of one man, a man so dangerous that Rommel himself had warned Berlin about him, a man Berlin chose to ignore. This is that story. To understand what Patton did, you have to understand exactly how bad Kasserine Pass really was. Not the sanitized version, the real version. It is early 1943. The war in North Africa has been grinding for 2 years. British forces under Montgomery have been pushing Rommel's Africa Corps westward from Egypt. Meanwhile, American forces, fresh, well-equipped, but almost entirely inexperienced, have landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. The plan is elegant in theory. Montgomery hammers from the east. American Second Corps pushes from the west. Rommel gets crushed between them. The problem is that the Americans have never fought the Wehrmacht before. They have trained, they have drilled, they have read the manuals. But there is a difference between training and combat that no manual can bridge, and in February 1943, that difference is about to cost 6,000 men everything. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commands American Second Corps. He is, by every measurable standard, a disaster. His headquarters sits in a canyon 70 miles behind the front lines, a headquarters that took 3 weeks and 200 engineers to dig into the rock. Resources that could have built actual defensive fortifications. Fredendall issues orders by telephone and radio without once visiting his frontline commanders. When his officers ask for clarification, the orders they receive back are more confusing than the originals. He communicates with his subordinates using a personal code so obscure that his own staff can barely decode it. On February 19th, Rommel strikes. German armor concentrates against the weakest point in the American line. A textbook maneuver from a man who has been executing textbook maneuvers with terrifying precision since 1940. The Africa Corps does not ask permission. It does not telegraph its intentions. It hits hard, fast, and without mercy. American units collapse, not because the soldiers are cowards. The evidence is clear that individual American soldiers fought with genuine bravery when cornered, but because the command structure evaporates under pressure. Radio discipline collapses. Units retreat without orders. creating panic that cascades down the line. Artillery that could have been devastating fires scattered, uncoordinated rounds that accomplish almost nothing. Infantry and armor operate in complete isolation from each other, each fighting their own private war, while the Germans fight one coordinated battle. By February 25th, 6 days after it began, the numbers tell the story that no commander wants to tell. 6,000 Americans dead, wounded, or captured. Approximately 183 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Nearly 200 artillery pieces lost. Rommel's forces have pushed 50 miles into Allied lines. Rommel sits in his command post and writes a letter to his wife Lucy. The letter is not gloating. Rommel was many things, but he was not a man who gloated. The letter is analytical, clinical. He writes that the Americans lack training, that their officers make mistakes that would result in court-martial in any European army, that their command coordination is non-existent. He concludes with an assessment that Berlin takes as authorization. If Germany strikes again in March, before the Americans have time to recover, the result will be similar. Strike now. Don't give them time to adapt. Berlin agrees. What Berlin does not know, what Rommel himself cannot fully anticipate, is that the United States Army is about to perform the single fastest institutional transformation in the history of modern warfare. And the man responsible for that transformation arrives at 2nd Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943, with sirens blaring, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming in the Tunisian sun, and an expression on his face that makes every officer present suddenly very aware of their posture. George Smith Patton, Jr. is not a subtle man. He was born in 1885 in California into a military family with roots going back to the American Revolution. His grandfather was a Confederate colonel killed at Cedar Creek. His father was a lawyer, but the house was filled with military history, military stories, military obsession. Young George Patton grew up believing that he had been a warrior in previous lives, that he had fought at Marathon, at Crécy, at Waterloo. And while that belief sounds eccentric, it drove in him a quality that is almost impossible to manufacture. Absolute certainty that combat was his natural environment. He was not a gifted student. He was dyslexic at a time when dyslexia was not understood, and he struggled through West Point academically while excelling at everything physical. He competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics, finishing 5th overall and placing 3rd in fencing, 4th in shooting. He served in the punitive expedition chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico, where he led what is widely considered the first motorized cavalry charge in American military history. He drove a car directly into a battle, which in 1916 was considered somewhere between innovative and insane. In World War I, he became one of the Army's earliest tank commanders and took a bullet in the thigh during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, refusing evacuation until he had given his final orders. By 1943, Patton has 57 years of absolute commitment to one single idea: that war is won by aggression, speed, and the willingness to accept violence as the price of victory. He does not believe in defensive warfare. He does not believe in caution. He believes, with the complete conviction of a man who has read every military history ever written and memorized most of it, that the only way to break an enemy is to attack constantly, attack faster than the enemy can respond, and never, never give the enemy time to regain momentum. When Patton walks into 2nd Corps headquarters, what he finds appalls him. Not the soldiers are fine. What appalls him is the atmosphere of defeat that has settled over the command like a physical weight. Officers are not wearing proper uniforms. Helmets are absent in an active combat zone. The paperwork is chaotic. The supply lines are a disaster. The men moved through their duties with the slow, defeated shuffle of people who no longer believe that what they are doing matters. Patton understands something that is not immediately obvious. The outward signs of military discipline, the uniforms, the salutes, the regulations, are not about vanity. They are not about making soldiers look pretty. They are about communicating a single idea to every man in the organization. You are a professional, not a victim. When Patton orders officers to wear ties in the desert heat, he is not being cruel. He is forcing men to make a physical decision every single morning that they are soldiers first and suffering men second. The discomfort of a tie in 100-degree heat is the point. It is a daily reminder that the uniform means something, and that the man inside it is expected to perform at the level the uniform demands. The fines begin immediately. Officers who arrive at briefings out of uniform are penalized on the spot. Soldiers who fail to salute are reprimanded publicly. Unit commanders who cannot explain the tactical situation in their sector are relieved within 24 hours. Patton fires generals the way other commanders issue memos. The message reaches every rank simultaneously and without ambiguity. The old Second Corps is dead. This is something different now. But discipline is the visible surface of what Patton is doing. Underneath it, he is conducting a complete doctrinal revolution. Every unit receives new standing orders. When attacked, do not retreat. Counterattack. Every defensive position becomes an attack platform. Artillery coordination, which had been the single greatest failure at Kasserine, becomes the obsession of Second Corps operations. Patton brings in artillery commanders and drills them on one concept that the Germans, with their largely horse-drawn artillery, cannot replicate: time on target. The principle is this: instead of having each artillery battery fire independently, you calculate the flight time from every battery to a single target. Then stagger the firing times so that every shell from every battery arrives at that target simultaneously. The result is not a scattered artillery barrage. It is a single, catastrophic explosion of coordinated steel that can destroy an armored formation in seconds. The Germans have never faced this. Most armies have never faced this. It requires calculation, coordination, and a level of trust between units that only exists inside an organization where every member believes in the same doctrine. Anti-tank weapons are repositioned. At Kasserine, American tank destroyers had been placed in obvious defensive positions: forward, visible, predictable. German armor identified them easily and destroyed them before closing with the infantry. Patton orders them repositioned to flanking positions, concealed, angled to create crossfire. A German tank advancing toward an American position will now face fire from multiple directions simultaneously. There is no armor angle that protects against shots from the front and the side at the same time. Infantry receives new orders about withdrawal. If withdrawal becomes necessary, it will not be a retreat. It will be a fighting withdrawal. Movement to a prepared secondary position where the same defensive coordination immediately resumes. No unit abandons its position without specific orders, and those orders include the precise location of the new position and the time by which it must be occupied and ready. German intelligence watches these changes with what can only be described as professional skepticism. Their assessment is logical. One general cannot fix systemic problems in 3 weeks. You cannot teach an entire corps new doctrine in 21 days. The transformation at Kasserine was not simply bad leadership. It was the result of inadequate training, insufficient combat experience, and organizational structures that had never been tested under real pressure. 3 weeks of Patton is not 3 months of combat. German commanders prepare their March offensive with the same assumptions that had made Kasserine possible. Americans will defend from fixed positions. Americans will hesitate under pressure. Americans will retreat when German armor concentrates. They are about to be proven catastrophically wrong. March 22, 1943. The 10th Panzer Division moves toward American positions at El Ghoutar. Their order of battle is formidable. Mark V tanks with 75mm guns that can penetrate Sherman armor at 2,000 yards, while the Sherman's gun requires the crew to close to 500 yards for effective penetration. The technical disparity is real and significant. German commanders brief their units on expected American responses the same way they have briefed every offensive since 1940. The formula has worked against France. It has worked against the Soviet Union. It worked against these same Americans 3 weeks ago. At dawn on March 23rd, German armor rolls forward. The terrain is open. Visibility is good. Everything matches the operational plan. Then, the American artillery opens fire. Not ranging shots, not scattered harassment fire. Time-on-target salvos, multiple batteries, every gun in Second Corps that can reach the target grid, all arriving simultaneously. The first barrage lands on the advancing German formation like the earth has decided to stand up. German tank commanders, who have fought across 3 continents and survived some of the most intense combat of the war, report something they have not encountered before. The accuracy is not like normal artillery. Normal artillery requires adjustment, spotting rounds, corrections, gradual walking of fire onto target. This fire is on target from the first salvo. It means the Americans have forward observers who are professional, calm, and communicating with precision. It means the American artillery crews have executed their coordination mathematics correctly under pressure. It means that everything Patton drilled into Second Corps over 21 days has taken hold at the exact moment it needs to.
And Eddie Larkin, the welder from Pittsburgh, the man who pressed his back against a burning half-track 3 weeks ago and watched his world collapse, is not running anymore. He is on the gun. He has a target. He has a range. He has orders that make sense. And for the first time since he crossed the Atlantic, he is part of a machine that is working. The 10th Panzer Division pushes forward. They take casualties but continue. This is expected resistance. This is what German doctrine says to push through. But the Americans are not breaking. They are withdrawing to secondary positions and resuming fire. The anti-tank weapons that German armor expected to find in predictable locations are firing from angles that require the tank commander to choose which threat to face, knowing that choosing one leaves the other unchallenged. By noon, the German advance has stalled. By the afternoon of March 24th, German commanders are recommending suspension of the offensive. The assessment coming back to headquarters is something no German commander in North Africa has written before. American resistance is organized. American casualties are acceptable. American units are not breaking under pressure. Something fundamental has changed. What has changed is 21 days of Patton. Rommel had warned Berlin. He had written, in letters that became part of the official record, that if Germany did not strike before the Americans adapted, the situation would become dangerous. Berlin had read those letters and concluded that 3 weeks was not enough time for any army to transform. Rommel's warning had been logical. Berlin's conclusion had been reasonable. And both had been completely, irreversibly wrong. The Germans would study El Ghoutar for months. They would interview prisoners. They would analyze captured documents. They would write assessments that tried to explain how 21 days had produced this. The answer they kept arriving at
was the same answer that would follow American forces through Sicily, through Normandy, through France, and into Germany itself. The Americans had found their doctrine, and doctrine, it turns out, matters more than tanks. But the battle at El Guitar is only the beginning of what the Second Corps is about to accomplish. Because as German commanders in Tunisia are recalibrating their entire understanding of American military capability, something is happening in Berlin that nobody on the Allied side has yet fully understood. Rommel's health is failing. His replacement has just made the kind of mistake that losing armies make. The mistake of underestimating an opponent who has just proven that estimation wrong. And in the next phase of the North African campaign, Patton is about to unleash the Second Corps in a series of operations that will not just defeat the Africa Corps. They will destroy it completely, capture 250,000 prisoners, and end the entire North African campaign in a way that changes the strategic balance of the war. But to understand how that happens, you need to understand what Patton did next. Because what he did next was considered by almost every senior officer around him to be completely insane. It was aggressive to the point of recklessness. It violated accepted military doctrine. His own superiors tried to stop him. He did it anyway. El Guitar had proven something that nobody in Berlin was willing to believe. 21 days. That was all Patton needed to transform the most humiliated corps in American military history into a force that stopped the 10th Panzer Division cold and sent German commanders back to their maps in stunned silence. Eddie Larkin, the welder from Pittsburgh who had pressed his back against a burning half-track 3 weeks earlier, had stood his ground. The Big Red One had stood its ground, and for the first time in the North African campaign, German armor had retreated from American positions rather than through them. But El Guitar was a defensive victory. Stopping an attack is not the same as winning a war. Patton knew that. And what Patton wanted to do next, what he believed with absolute conviction was the only path to destroying the Africa Corps completely, was considered by almost every senior officer around him to be reckless, premature, and potentially suicidal. In the spring of 1943, approximately 300,000 Axis troops remained in Tunisia. Allied High Command had a plan to squeeze them slowly, methodically, conservatively. Patton had a different plan, and the men who controlled the resources he needed to execute it wanted nothing to do with him. This is where the real battle began. Not in the desert, in the headquarters. General Harold Alexander commanded 18th Army Group, the combined Allied force in Tunisia. He was British, precise, politically careful, and he had spent 2 years watching American forces perform with results that ranged from mediocre to catastrophic. El Guitar had impressed him, but impression and trust are different things. When Patton submitted his operational proposal in late March, an aggressive Second Corps thrust toward the coast that would cut off Axis supply lines and trap the remaining German and Italian forces before they could consolidate, Alexander's response was measured, polite, and completely dismissive. The meeting took place on March 28, 1943, at 18th Army Group headquarters. Alexander looked at the operational map for a long moment. Then he said, "George, your men performed well at El Guitar, but what you're proposing here requires sustained offensive momentum that Second Corps has not yet demonstrated. We cannot risk a repeat of February." Patton kept his voice level. "With respect, sir, what happened in February is not what exists today. I will stake my career on that." "You may be doing exactly that," Alexander replied. The proposal was tabled. Second Corps would support British operations. It would not lead them. American forces would secure flanks, hold positions, perform the useful but unglamorous work of an army that had not yet fully earned the confidence of its allies. Patton walked out of that meeting and said nothing to his staff. He did not need to. The expression on his face communicated everything. Meanwhile, the clock was running. Every day that Axis forces remained in Tunisia was a day they could be reinforcing positions, evacuating key personnel, strengthening the defensive perimeter around Tunis and Bizerte. German engineers were working 20 hours a day building fortifications. Intelligence reports indicated that Rommel's replacement, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, was requesting additional supplies and manpower. The window for a decisive, war-ending blow in North Africa was not unlimited. It was measured in weeks. Patton understood something that Alexander, with his methodical British strategic patience, had not fully calculated. The Americans did not need months of additional seasoning. They needed one more offensive. One more coordinated, aggressive, properly led offensive that would prove El Guettar was not an exception, but a standard. And the man who helped Patton make that argument was not another general. He was a logistician. Brigadier General Leroy Lutz had arrived in North Africa as part of an Army Service Forces inspection team, tasked with evaluating supply chain performance across the theater. He was not a combat commander. He was not glamorous. He was 51 years old and spent most of his time reading inventory reports. But Lutz had watched the transformation of Second Corps with the analytical precision of a man who understood systems. And what he saw at El Guettar was not just a military victory. It was proof of concept for an organizational model that the entire United States Army needed to understand. Lutz went to Patton. He said he could make the logistical case to Alexander's staff that Second Corps had the supply integrity to sustain a major offensive without the resupply failures that had plagued American operations in February. Numbers, not speeches, numbers. Patton listened for approximately 45 seconds before agreeing. They had one opportunity to make the case. Alexander had scheduled a full theater commanders conference for April 4th. If Patton and Lutz could not present a compelling operational and logistical argument in that single meeting, Second Corps would spend the remainder of the Tunisian campaign on the Allied right flank, guarding Montgomery's supply lines, while British forces received the credit for ending the North African War. One meeting, one chance. If they failed, Patton's window in North Africa closed permanently. April 4th, 1943. The conference room at 18th Army Group Headquarters held 15 senior officers. British, American, French. Maps covered every wall. The atmosphere was the particular kind of polite tension that exists when men who disagree profoundly are trying to appear collegial. Alexander opened by presenting the current operational situation. Axis forces were consolidating in the northeastern corner of Tunisia. British 8th Army was advancing from the south. First Army was pressing from the west. The plan was methodical encirclement, conservative, low risk, designed to minimize casualties and avoid the kind of catastrophic failure that had defined the campaign's first months. Patton waited until Alexander finished. Then he stood up. He did not begin with rhetoric. He began with numbers. In the 30 days since March 6th, Patton said, Second Corps has conducted 47 separate engagements. Our kill ratio against German armor has increased from 0.3 to 1.7. Our artillery accuracy, measured in first salvo target acquisitions, has gone from 11% to 64%. Our logistics pipeline, which failed completely in February, has maintained 91% supply availability through sustained combat operations. These are not projections. These are recorded results. He paused. Nobody spoke. What I am proposing is not a risk. What I am proposing is an application of demonstrated capability.
Second Corps can drive north from El Ghoutar, reach the coast at Sfax within 8 days, and sever the main Axis supply line before von Arnim can reposition his reserves. If we wait for methodical encirclement, we give the Germans time to evacuate their best commanders and equipment to Italy. If we move now, we end this campaign in Tunisia, instead of continuing it in Sicily. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. A British general named Anderson said, "You're talking about a 50-mile offensive thrust with an army that was combat ineffective 6 weeks ago." "I'm talking about a 50-mile offensive thrust with an army that has proved itself in the last 3 weeks," Patton replied. "Sir, with respect, the army that lost at Kasserine does not exist anymore. I would appreciate the opportunity to prove that completely rather than partially." Lutz presented the logistics brief: supply tonnage, fuel reserves, ammunition stockpiles, medical evacuation capacity. The numbers were exact, verified, and significantly better than anyone in the room had expected from an American corps that had been in logistical chaos 2 months earlier. Alexander looked at the maps for a long time. Then he approved a modified version of the proposal. Second Corps would not drive to the coast independently, but it would conduct an aggressive northward offensive through the mountainous terrain toward Bizerta, applying direct pressure on the German northern flank while British forces pressed from the south and east. It was not everything Patton wanted. It was enough. The operation began on April 23, 1943. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not a repeat of El Ghoutar. It was something beyond El Ghoutar. Second Corps moved through the Tunisian mountains with a speed and coordination that German commanders had not anticipated and could not counter. The time-on-target artillery doctrine that Patton had drilled into his gunners performed in mountainous terrain the way it had performed in open desert, with devastating precision that shut down German counterattack formations before they could achieve momentum. American infantry, fighting through terrain that favored defenders at almost every point, did not stop when they met resistance. They flanked, they probed, they found the weak point, and pushed through it while fixing the German defenders in place with fire from multiple directions. The German units opposing Second Corps in the Tunisian mountains were not second-rate formations. They were experienced veterans who had been fighting since 1940. They executed their defensive doctrine with professional skill. And they were losing ground every day to an American army that 3 months earlier had been considered incapable of sustained offensive operations. German tactical reports from this period reveal something striking. The complaints are not about American equipment or American numbers. They are about American method. American infantry does not stop when it takes casualties. American artillery does not allow time to regroup. American commanders do not pause at their objectives. They immediately begin preparing the next assault. One German regimental commander wrote in his after-action report that American forces in April 1943 fought with a tempo that made conventional defensive planning impossible. By the time a German defensive line was prepared, the Americans were already on it. On May 7, 1943, American forces entered Bizerte. The same day, British forces entered Tunis. The Axis pocket collapsed almost immediately. 6 days later, on May 13th, General von Arnim surrendered. 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their weapons. It was the largest single surrender of Axis forces in the war to that point. The North African campaign was over. The transformation from Kasserine to Bizerte had taken 83 days. In those 83 days, American Second Corps had gone from an organization that lost 6,000 men in 6 days to an organization that helped capture 250,000 enemy soldiers. The doctrine that Patton had installed in 21 days had proven itself
not just at El Qatar, but across 3 months of sustained, escalating combat operations. German generals who had written in February that Americans would need a year to become effective fighters were now composing after-action reports, trying to explain how it had happened so fast. But here is what the victory reports and the prisoner counts and the congratulatory telegrams from Washington did not capture. Here is what was happening in Berlin and Rome while Allied forces celebrated in Tunis. German intelligence had been watching the American transformation with growing alarm since El Qatar. They had analysts. They had captured documents. They had interrogated American prisoners. And by May 1943, German intelligence had reached a conclusion that was classified at the highest level and shared with only a handful of senior commanders. The conclusion was this: the Americans had not just developed effective doctrine in North Africa, they had developed a template, a repeatable, scalable, institutional method for rapid transformation that could be applied to any formation, at any scale, in any theater of war. What Patton had done with Second Corps in Tunisia could be done again, with a larger force, against a more heavily defended objective, in terrain that was even more challenging. The intelligence report named the most likely next target, Sicily, and it identified the American commander most likely to lead the assault. That report reached Rommel in Germany, where he was still recovering from the illness that had forced him out of Tunisia before its end. Rommel read it carefully. Then he wrote a memorandum to OKW, German High Command, that was more urgent in tone than anything he had written since 1941. The memorandum warned that Allied forces would land in southern Europe within weeks. It warned that American tactical capability had advanced to the point where static coastal defense was insufficient. It warned that the only viable counter to American offensive doctrine was immediate, aggressive, armored counterattack before the beachhead could be established. The memorandum included a specific recommendation. German panzer reserves needed to be positioned close to the likely invasion beaches, ready to move within hours of the first Allied landing. If the reserves were held back, if they were kept inland, waiting for the invasion's direction to become clear, it would be too late. American forces would establish momentum. And once American forces had momentum, Rommel now knew from painful experience, stopping them required resources that Germany in 1943 could not afford to spend. OKW received the memorandum. They discussed it at the highest levels. They acknowledged Rommel's concerns, and then they assigned him to France and told him his panzer reserves would remain under Hitler's personal command. The decision that would determine the fate of the entire Western Front had just been made, and it was the wrong one. But the consequences of that decision, the catastrophic war-ending consequences, would not become clear until the morning of June 6, 1944, when the largest amphibious invasion in human history hit the beaches of Normandy. The same American army that had learned to fight in the deserts of Tunisia was about to come ashore in France. And this time, there were not 300,000 of them. There were 2 million. 250,000 Axis prisoners. 83 days. That was what Patton and Second Corps had delivered in Tunisia. The largest single Axis surrender of the war, achieved by an army that German commanders had written off as permanently broken. El Qatar had proved the transformation was real. Bizerte had proved it was permanent. And now, as Allied planners turned their eyes toward Sicily and then France, the doctrine that had been born in the Tunisian desert was about to be tested at a scale that nobody, not Patton, not Eisenhower, not Rommel himself, had yet fully imagined. But German intelligence had been watching. They had been studying. And by the summer of 1943, they had reached conclusions about American fighting doctrine that were alarming enough to classify at the highest level. The question was whether anyone in Berlin would listen. They would not. And that failure to listen would cost Germany everything. German analysts had dissected every after-action report from Tunisia with a methodical precision that made the Wehrmacht genuinely frightening as an institutional opponent. They counted artillery rounds. They mapped tank positions. They traced the timing of American counterattacks to the minute. By June 1943, the intelligence picture was clear and deeply troubling. American forces had developed 3 interconnected capabilities that individually were manageable, but together created something that conventional German defensive doctrine could not reliably counter. First, time-on-target artillery had evolved beyond what German observers had initially reported. American gunners in Tunisia were achieving first salvo accuracy rates of 64%, meaning nearly 2/3 of initial barrages landed on target without adjustment. German artillery doctrine assumed a minimum of 3 to 5 ranging rounds before effective fire could be delivered. American doctrine had essentially eliminated that window. By the time German commanders recognized they were under artillery attack, the most destructive phase was already over. Second, American combined arms coordination, infantry, armor, artillery, and air working as a single integrated system, had reached a level of tactical sophistication that German unit commanders found difficult to describe accurately in their reports. It was not that each American element was superior to its German counterpart. German tanks were still technically better. German infantry was still more experienced. But the American elements operated in a mutually reinforcing cycle that meant attacking any single component immediately drew fire from the others. Destroying American tanks brought artillery. Suppressing American artillery brought infantry flanking movements. Attacking American infantry brought armor. There was no clean entry point. Third, and most alarming, American commanders at every level had internalized offensive momentum as a doctrinal imperative. German defensive doctrine was built around the assumption that attackers would pause at objectives to consolidate and resupply. American units in Tunisia had repeatedly violated this assumption, pushing through objectives and immediately attacking the next position before German reserves could be repositioned. This tempo, faster than doctrine, faster than logistics theory said was sustainable, was producing tactical results that German commanders found genuinely difficult to explain. The intelligence report landed on the desk of German Army Group planning staff in late June 1943. It recommended 3 immediate responses: deeper defensive positions, mobile panzer reserves positioned within striking distance of likely landing beaches, and most critically, immediate counterattack doctrine. Any Allied landing must be hit within 6 hours, before American forces could establish the momentum that made them nearly unstoppable. The report was read. It was filed. Partial measures were implemented. The Panzer Reserve recommendation, the single most important element, was rejected because Hitler refused to release armored forces from his personal command. German defensive planning for Sicily and France continued on the assumption that static coastal fortifications would slow the Allied advance long enough for reserves to respond. Rommel, reading the same intelligence from his command post in France, wrote in his personal diary that this decision would prove catastrophic. He was correct. But the catastrophe had not yet arrived. First, there was Sicily. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky. The largest amphibious invasion in history to that point. 160,000 Allied troops, 3,000 ships, 4,000 aircraft, hitting the southern coast of Sicily simultaneously at multiple points. American 7th Army under Patton landed on the southwestern coast. British 8th Army under Montgomery landed to the east. The original Allied plan assigned the main axis of advance to Montgomery pushing north along the eastern coast toward Messina. Patton's 7th Army would protect Montgomery's left flank. It was, in Patton's assessment, a supporting role that wasted the most aggressive army in the Allied order of battle. Patton had different ideas. The first 72 hours of Operation Husky produced the clearest demonstration yet of what American doctrine had become. German and Italian defenders had prepared coastal positions with genuine skill. The terrain of southern Sicily, rough, rocky, dominated by high ground that gave defenders observation over every approach, should have produced slow, grinding, attritional combat. American forces had faced terrain advantages like this in the Tunisian mountains and had taken casualties. Sicily was supposed to be harder. It wasn't. American infantry hit the beaches and kept moving. Artillery teams established positions and began firing within 40 minutes of landing, a timeline that German defensive planners had calculated as impossible for forces coming off landing craft. When German armor counterattacked at Gela on July 11th, attempting to drive the Americans back into the sea before the beachhead could be consolidated, it ran directly into the coordinated fire system that had destroyed the 10th Panzer Division at El Ghatar. The Hermann Göring Division committed 60 tanks to the Gela counterattack. American artillery, naval gunfire, and anti-tank weapons destroyed 30 of them in 90 minutes. The remainder retreated. 30 tanks, 90 minutes. The counterattack that was supposed to collapse the American beachhead before it could be established had instead proved that the doctrine worked, not just in the desert, but on any terrain, under any conditions, against any force that tried to mass armor against a coordinated American defensive position. By July 13th, the American beachhead was secure. Patton looked at his maps and made a decision. He was not going to protect Montgomery's flank. He was going to race him to Messina. The drive across Sicily began on July 19th. Patton sent 2nd Corps north to cut the island in half, while he personally led a flying column westward and then north along the coast. The operational concept was audacious to the point of recklessness, splitting the army, moving on multiple axes simultaneously, maintaining supply lines that were stretched past what doctrine said was safe. Every logistics officer on his staff told him the advance was moving too fast to sustain. Patton told them to find a way. The 3rd Infantry Division covered 100 miles in 4 days. Not because the terrain was easy, it wasn't. Not because German resistance had collapsed, it hadn't. The 3rd Infantry Division covered 100 miles in 4 days, because Patton had spent 5 months drilling into every officer in 7th Army the same principle he had drilled into 2nd Corps in Tunisia. Speed kills hesitation. Momentum is armor. The enemy cannot defend what he cannot predict. German defenders in Sicily were genuinely good soldiers executing a competent fighting withdrawal. Their after-action reports from this period are remarkable documents. Not complaints about American equipment or American numbers, but expressions of professional frustration at an opponent who simply would not slow down. One German regimental commander wrote that his unit would establish a defensive line, prepare fields of fire, coordinate artillery support, and before the preparation was complete, American infantry was already on the position. Not attacking it, on it. The timeline that German defensive doctrine assumed between American contact and American assault had collapsed to the point where it was tactically meaningless. Patton's forces entered Palermo on July 22nd. The city fell in a single day. 45,000 Italian soldiers surrendered. Patton had captured the largest city in Sicily in 12 days from the initial landing. He was not finished. The race to Messina in August 1943 became the defining image of what American offensive doctrine could achieve at full operational tempo. Patton conducted 3 amphibious end runs along the northern coast, landing troops behind German defensive lines to cut off retreating units, while his main force pressed frontally. Each landing was executed with a speed and coordination that the German defenders could not respond to before the trap had already closed. German commander General Hans Valentin Hube conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal. The professional respect that German generals had for each other's competence was genuine. But he was withdrawing against an army that had absorbed his tactical lessons in North Africa and had simply gotten faster. August 17, 1943. American forces entered Messina at 10:15 in the morning. British forces arrived 2 hours later. The Sicilian campaign was over in 38 days. German casualties exceeded 29,000 killed, wounded, or captured. American casualties were approximately 8,800, a ratio that would have been considered impossible in July 1943, given the terrain, the defenders' advantage, and the quality of the German forces involved. The news reached German high command within hours. The operational post-mortems began immediately. German analysts who had been studying American doctrine since El Guettar now had 3 complete operational data sets: Tunisia, the Gela counterattack, and the drive across Sicily. And the pattern was undeniable. American forces had not just improved, they had developed a doctrinal identity that was fundamentally different from every other army Germany had faced. And that identity was built around a single characteristic that German military culture had never fully institutionalized: the willingness to accept tactical uncertainty in order to maintain operational momentum. German doctrine optimized for certainty. Identify the objective, prepare the assault, coordinate every element, execute with precision. It was a doctrine that produced extraordinary results when the preparation phase could be completed. American doctrine under Patton had been specifically engineered to collapse that preparation phase. Hit before the defense is ready. Move before the reserve can respond. Attack the timeline, not just the position. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, issued new tactical guidance to all units in September 1943. The guidance acknowledged directly that American offensive tempo made conventional linear defense untenable. Units must prepare deeper positions. Reserves must be kept mobile. Counterattacks must be launched faster. The Germans were, for the first time in the war, rewriting their doctrine in direct response to what an opposing army had done to them. It was the clearest possible measure of what Patton had achieved. When the best army in the world starts changing how it fights because of you, the transformation is complete. But the scale of what was coming made Sicily look like a rehearsal. Allied planners were finalizing Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. 2 million men, the largest military operation in human history. The doctrine developed in Tunisia and proven in Sicily would now be applied against the Atlantic Wall, against the full weight of German defensive preparation in France, against an enemy who had been studying American methods for a year and had built his entire defensive strategy around stopping them. Rommel commanded those French defenses. He had read every intelligence report. He had written his memoranda. He had argued for panzer reserves close to the beaches. He had been overruled. And now, in the spring of 1944, he was sitting in his headquarters in France, looking at maps and writing in his diary that if the invasion came and the reserves were not released within the first 24 hours, Germany would lose the war in the West. He was right. And he knew he was right. And there was nothing he could do about it. The army that had learned to fight in the deserts of Tunisia was coming. The army that had run through Sicily in 38 days was coming. The army that had turned a welder from Pittsburgh named Eddie Larkin into a professional soldier who could execute time-on-target fire missions under combat pressure was coming. 2 million of them, across the English Channel, onto the beaches of Normandy. June 6th, 1944, was coming. And the man who had warned Berlin, who had written the letters, filed the reports, argued the case, and been ignored at every step, would watch from his headquarters as everything he had predicted came true with a precision that history rarely delivers. But what happened to Patton on the eve of the greatest invasion in history is a story that almost nobody knows. Because in the weeks before D-Day, Patton was not leading an army. He was standing in England, effectively sidelined, the victim of a controversy that had almost ended his career completely. How a man who had just proven himself the most effective combat commander in the American Army came within hours of being sent home, and what that near disaster meant for the outcome of the entire war, is the chapter that the history books skim past. That chapter is next. From a welder from Pittsburgh who pressed his back against a burning half-track and watched his world collapse, to an army that captured 250,000 prisoners in 83 days. From the humiliation of Kasserine Pass to the beaches of Sicily conquered in 38 days. From a doctrine that didn't exist in February 1943 to a war machine that rewrote the German military handbook. That was the journey of Patton and American Second Corps. A transformation so complete, so rapid, that the men who lived through it sometimes struggled to explain how it had happened. But we left one question unanswered at the end of Part 3. The question that matters more than any battle, any statistic, any captured city. What happened to the man who made all of it possible? And what happened to Eddie Larkin, the welder from Pittsburgh who had become, without anyone planning it that way, a symbol of everything American doctrine could achieve? Because success, it turns out, sometimes comes with a price that the history books don't record. George Patton came within hours of missing D-Day entirely. In the spring of 1944, while Rommel was preparing his Atlantic Wall defenses and Allied planners were finalizing Operation Overlord, Patton was standing in a hospital in Knutsford, England, at a small social gathering for servicewomen. He made an offhand remark, casual, throwaway, the kind of comment a man makes when he's not thinking about headlines. He said that it was the destiny of the British and Americans to rule the world after the war. He forgot to mention the Russians. The remark was reported. The press turned it into an international incident. Eisenhower received demands from Washington that Patton be relieved of command permanently. For 11 days, the fate of the most effective combat commander in the American Army hung on a single decision. Eisenhower sat with the question and understood what was at stake. Patton had faults that were real and serious. His temper was legendary. His mouth operated faster than his judgment. But Eisenhower also knew, because Tunisia and Sicily had proved it beyond any reasonable argument, that Patton produced results that no other American commander could replicate. Relieving Patton meant sending the most aggressive, most proven offensive commander in the Allied order of battle home to California, while the largest invasion in history was being planned without him. Eisenhower kept him. Patton was assigned to command the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, a ghost army designed to deceive German intelligence into believing the main invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. For weeks, Patton played his role in the deception operation with the professional discipline of a man who understood that sometimes the most important thing a soldier can do is nothing. German intelligence, convinced that the Allies would not waste Patton on a secondary landing, kept the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais for critical weeks after D-Day, waiting for the main assault that never came. The deception worked in part because the Germans had spent a year studying Patton carefully enough to trust their model of his behavior. And Patton used their own respect for him against them. On August 1st, 1944, Patton took command of the newly activated Third Army in France. What followed was the most spectacular sustained offensive of the war in the West. Third Army broke out of the Normandy beachhead and swept across France at a pace that even Patton's Sicilian campaign had not fully anticipated. In the last 2 weeks of August 1944, Third Army advanced further and faster than any army in the history of warfare to that point, covering ground at a rate that outran its own supply lines, and eventually forced a halt not because of German resistance, but because there was no fuel left to put in the tanks. Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a car accident in Germany. He was 60 years old. He had survived 3 years of combat command: Tunisia, Sicily, France, the Battle of the Bulge, the drive into Germany, without a serious wound. He died in a peacetime traffic accident, in a country he had helped defeat, before he could return to the United States to see what his army had built. His wife Beatrice received the news at their home in Massachusetts. She later wrote that George had always believed he would die in battle, that a peaceful death would have seemed wrong to him somehow, an anticlimax after everything. But there was nothing peaceful about dying in Germany in December 1945, surrounded by the wreckage of a war that had cost 50 million lives. It was simply the end, quiet and unheroic, for a man who had never been either. He never received the 5th star. He never became general of the army. Men he had outperformed in the field, men whose careers he had overshadowed with results they could not match. Held ranks he was never given. The politics of the military had always been as real as the politics of any institution, and Patton had spent his career offending the politicians while winning the battles. The history books remember him correctly as one of the greatest combat commanders in American history. The promotion list did not reflect that during his lifetime. Eddie Larkin, the welder from Pittsburgh, the man whose story opened this entire series, went home to Pennsylvania in late 1945. He returned to his job at the steel plant. He married. He had 3 children. He did not speak extensively about his war service to his family, the way that many veterans of his generation did not speak about it, carrying their experiences as private weight rather than public identity. His daughter gave an interview to a local Pennsylvania newspaper in 1987 on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. She said her father occasionally mentioned North Africa. He mentioned Kasserine Pass with a particular kind of quiet. Not shame, exactly, but the silence of a man remembering something that had tested him at the deepest level. And he mentioned El Guitar differently. He mentioned it the way a man mentions the moment he understood what he was capable of. He died in 1991. He was 71 years old. He never received a medal for El Guitar specifically, because the artillery crews who executed the time-on-target fire missions that stopped the 10th Panzer Division received the same unit citations as everyone else in Second Corps. There was no individual recognition for the transformation, because the transformation, by definition, belonged to everyone who had lived through it. But the legacy of what Patton built in those 21 days in Tunisia did not stay in Tunisia. It did not stay in World War II. It became the foundational doctrine of the United States Army for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. Time-on-target artillery coordination became standard doctrine across every branch of American military service by 1944, and remained standard doctrine through Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and into modern combined arms operations. The principle that every gun within range of a target should be able to deliver simultaneous fire, that the most devastating effect of artillery is not the shells, but the coordination, is taught at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to every American artillery officer trained in the last 80 years. The specific techniques were refined. The technology changed dramatically. The underlying principle that Patton drilled into Second Corps in March 1943 did not change at all. The combined arms integration model, infantry, armor, artillery, and air operating as a single coordinated system, rather than parallel but separate forces, became the organizing principle of American military doctrine through every conflict that followed. Korean War commanders studied the Tunisian and Sicilian campaigns explicitly. Vietnam-era doctrine manuals cited North Africa as the proving ground for combined arms theory. When American forces executed the 100-hour ground campaign of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, military analysts noted that the operational tempo and combined arms coordination bore direct doctrinal lineage to the methods Patton had established in 1943. General Norman Schwarzkopf, asked after Desert Storm what had made the ground campaigns so fast, cited the tradition of American offensive doctrine going back to World War II. He named Tunisia specifically. The doctrine spread beyond American forces. NATO allies adopted modified versions of combined arms integration throughout the Cold War. The Israeli Defense Forces, studying American operational performance in World War II, incorporated time-on-target fire principles into their artillery doctrine in the 1950s, and executed variations of it with devastating effect in the 1967 and 1973 wars. Military historians who have studied the spread of American doctrinal influence estimate that the principles developed under combat conditions in Tunisia between March and May 1943 have been applied in some form in every major conflict involving Western militaries for the past 80 years. The number that summarizes this legacy most completely is not a military statistic. It is a calculation that military historians have attempted and inevitably found imprecise, but directionally clear. The acceleration of the Allied victory in Europe, the difference between the timeline that German commanders predicted in February 1943 and the timeline that actually occurred, is estimated at between 12 and 18 months. If American forces had continued to perform at the Kasserine Pass level, if the doctrinal transformation had not happened under Patton in March 1943, the war in Europe would likely have continued through late 1946 or into 1947. The casualties that would have accumulated in those additional months, on all sides, in all theaters, represent a number that cannot be calculated precisely, but that every serious military historian agrees would have been enormous. 21 days of doctrine potentially shortened the most destructive war in human history by more than a year. Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows, the detail that was classified until 1979, and that has never fully entered the popular history of World War II, despite being one of the most remarkable facts of the entire conflict. In the summer of 1945, after Germany's surrender, American military intelligence teams were tasked with recovering German operational records before they could be destroyed or captured by Soviet forces. One team, operating in Bavaria, recovered a cache of documents from the former OKW planning staff, German High Command. Among those documents was a folder labeled, in translation, Assessment of Enemy Doctrine, American Forces, 1943 to 1945. Inside the folder was a compilation of every German intelligence report on American military performance from Kasserine Pass to the end of the war. The reports had been assembled chronologically and annotated by a senior OKW analyst whose identity was never established. The final annotation in the folder was dated April 1945, written during the last weeks of the war, as American forces were crossing the Rhine and driving toward Berlin. The annotation read, in translation, "The transformation observed in American forces between February and May 1943 remains the single most consequential doctrinal development of this war. We identified it correctly. We warned about it accurately. We did not respond to it adequately. The fault is not in our intelligence. The fault is that we did not believe an army could change that fast. We were wrong. They changed. We did not." The analyst who wrote those words was an officer who had spent 2 years tracking the evolution of American military doctrine. He had read Rommel's letters. He had filed the reports. He had watched from inside the German military intelligence apparatus as every warning was noted and then set aside. He had watched an army that Germany had defeated comprehensively in February 1943 become the force that ended German military power in Europe by May 1945. And in April 1945, with American tanks 30 miles from Berlin, he sat down and wrote the most honest assessment that German military intelligence produced during the entire war. He wrote it because he understood something that the generals and the politicians and the ideologues had never fully grasped. The Americans had not won because they had more men, though they did. They had not won because they had more equipment, though they had that too. They had won because 21 days in the Tunisian desert, a general with ivory-handled revolvers and 50 years of accumulated fury had forced an army to believe in itself again. And once an army believes in itself, once every soldier from the general to the welder from Pittsburgh understands that the doctrine works, that the training matters, that the person beside them is competent and the plan is sound, that army becomes something that cannot be defeated by technical superiority alone. From Kasserine Pass to the Rhine, from 6,000 casualties in 6 days to 250,000 prisoners in 83. From an army that broke and ran to an army that ended the most powerful military machine in modern history.